The conference room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner clicking in the corner. Alden pushed the demotion letter across the polished table without looking up, while Brielle settled into my chair with a bright, rehearsed smile. My chair. The one I'd sat in for 3 years as director of analytics. When Alden finally spoke, his voice was flat and matter-of-fact. You'll be reporting to Brielle now. She's taking over the analytics division. The words hit me like ice water. My fingertips went numb. Around the table, 6 pairs of eyes suddenly found the wood grain fascinating. Nobody would look at me. Brielle leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. Don't worry, Tessa. I'll ease you into the transition. I watched her fingers drum against the armrest, my armrest, and forced myself to swallow the humiliation rising in my throat. Because in that moment, staring at Alden's smug expression, I suddenly realized something they didn't know. Something that changed everything. My stomach dropped as nervous laughter rippled around the table. I stood there frozen, listening to Alden talk about better alignment for the company's future and fresh perspectives. The words blurred together. My hands felt cold. I couldn't breathe properly. Then it hit me with perfect clarity. This wasn't a business decision. This was intentional, planned, targeted. I'd been set up, pushed aside for someone who'd been at the company less than 8 months. The realization settled over me like frost. I looked straight at Brielle, meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd taken my seat. She flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. Her smile wavered for half a second before snapping back into place. She knew I knew. Alden was still talking something about transitional support and team dynamics, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was racing, connecting dots I'd been too busy to notice before. My name is Tessa Ward. I'm 34 years old, and this was the day my boss bet everything on the wrong person. I'd spent 3 years building the analytics division from scratch, creating systems that saved the company millions in operational costs. I'd presented to the board twice, both times to standing ovations. My quarterly reports were used as templates across 4 departments. And now I was being demoted to make room for Brielle Hastings, a woman who couldn't tell a pivot table from a pie chart. I gathered my notebook and stood up, keeping my expression neutral, professional. As I turned toward the door, my eyes caught something on Alden's laptop screen, a spreadsheet I recognized. My quarterly variance report. But the numbers looked wrong. Very wrong. I paused for just a second, memorizing what I could see, then walked out without a word. Behind me, I heard Brielle's voice rise with false enthusiasm, already trying to claim authority she hadn't earned. 3 days earlier, everything had seemed normal. I'd noticed Brielle hovering behind Alden during morning stand-ups, always positioning herself in his sightline. She'd laugh at jokes that weren't funny, nodding eagerly whenever he spoke. At the time, I dismissed it as typical new employee enthusiasm. I'd been focused on closing out Q3 reports, finalizing projections for the board meeting scheduled for next month. I remembered walking past Alden's office one afternoon and seeing them bent over his desk together, their heads close. When I knocked to ask about the procurement variance I'd flagged, Alden had waved me off. Brielle and I are handling that, he'd said. Not we're handling that. Brielle and I. Like they were a unit. I'd felt a small twist of unease then, but pushed it aside. I had work to do. Now, sitting in my car in the parking garage, I realized all those small moments had been signals. Warnings I'd been too blind to see. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, scrolling back through the last 2 weeks. There it was, the message from finance that had seemed odd at the time. Subject line: clarification needed on Q3 variance. The email detailed a $12,000 discrepancy in procurement spending, specifically in vendor payments. It should have gone to Alden as department head. Instead, it had landed in my inbox, probably a CC mistake. I'd forwarded it to Alden with a note. This came to me by accident, but thought you should see it. He'd never responded. I'd assumed he'd handled it directly, with finance. Now I pulled up the original numbers, comparing them against my own Q3 tracking sheet. The variance was in a vendor payment, something called Apex Solutions Consulting. I didn't recognize the name. I opened our approved vendor list. Apex Solutions wasn't on it. My pulse quickened. How had an unapproved vendor gotten paid $12,000? Walking back through the office that afternoon felt like swimming through fog. People glanced at me, then quickly looked away. The usual greetings were absent. At the coffee station, two junior analysts stopped talking when I approached. One of them, Marcus, gave me a sympathetic look before hurrying away. I thought she was getting promoted. I heard someone whisper from behind a cubicle wall. The words cut deeper than I expected. I headed to my desk and logged into the system to pull up the Q3 Analytics folder where I kept all my backup data. Access denied. I tried again. Same message. My badge had been deactivated from the shared drive. I sat back, staring at the error message. They'd moved fast. Less than 2 hours after the meeting, and I was already being erased. But they'd made a mistake. I kept backup copies of everything on my personal encrypted drive. 3 years of reports, emails, variance analyses, all safely stored where they couldn't touch it. The next morning, Brielle hosted a mandatory team meeting to announce her vision for restructuring workflows. She stood at the head of the conference room, wearing a sharp blazer that looked expensive. Too expensive for someone at her salary level. She kept calling me Tess like we were friends, like she hadn't just stolen my position. Tess will be supporting me on the foundational reporting, she announced, her voice bright. She's been so generous with her time. I sat silently in the back row, watching her stumble through basic terminology. She called our predictive models projection patterns and mispronounced heuristic twice. The team exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, she assigned me a task, rebuilding the monthly variance report. The same report I'd created 18 months ago. The same report she was supposed to be leading. Just to make sure we're all aligned on methodology, she said with that rehearsed smile. I nodded once. Of course. I made it to my car before the shock finally hit me. I sat in the parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming down my face. The humiliation replayed in an endless loop. Alden's flat voice, Brielle's false sympathy, the team's averted eyes. 3 years of work, erased in a 10-minute meeting. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I wiped my eyes and looked at the screen. An email from HR. Check-in meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please confirm your attendance. My stomach twisted. This was how they made it official. How they documented my adjustment period to justify the demotion if I complained later. I started the car, but didn't put it in gear. Instead, I sat there in the dim garage, listening to the engine idle. Then, slowly, my mind began to clear. The tears stopped. Something shifted inside me. If they wanted to underestimate me, I'd let them. HR's office smelled like vanilla air freshener and corporate anxiety. Vanessa from Human Resources smiled warmly, gesturing to a chair. How are you adjusting to the transition? She asked, her voice full of practiced concern. Not, why were you demoted? Not what happened. Just adjusting. I kept my expression neutral. It's been a learning experience. Vanessa nodded, typing notes on her laptop. She asked about team dynamics and workflow changes, skating around the real questions. I answered with careful professionalism, giving her nothing she could use against me. As we talked, my eyes wandered to the corner of her desk. There was a printed email, partially visible under a folder. I could only see the top portion, but I recognized the header, a message to Alden, subject line starting with approval signatures for. The rest was hidden. Vanessa noticed my gaze and casually moved the folder, covering the email completely. Any other concerns? She asked. None, I replied. That night, I stood in my apartment in front of my whiteboard, marker in hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm into Alden's office and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I chose something more powerful, strategic stillness.
Calm.
Calculated planning. I wrote everything I knew in neat columns. The unexplained vendor payment. The email that came to me by mistake. The numbers that didn't match on Alden's screen. The deactivated access. The HR meeting that felt like documentation theater. If they wanted to play games, I'd play better. I'd been underestimated before, by professors who doubted a woman could excel in data science, by my first boss who tried to take credit for my algorithms. I'd learned that the best revenge wasn't loud. It was meticulous. I opened my laptop and began building a timeline, cross-referencing every document I had saved. Somewhere in this mess was the truth, and I was going to find it. 2 days later, Brielle crashed during a small team meeting. Marcus asked a simple question about the project timeline for our quarterly forecast model. "When should we expect the new baseline parameters?" he asked. Brielle froze. Her smile stayed fixed, but her eyes went blank. "We're evaluating that," she stammered. "There are multiple considerations." Marcus frowned. "But we need to start the simulation runs by Friday, or we'll miss the board deadline." "I'm aware of the timeline," Brielle snapped. Then, catching herself, she softened. "Tessa, you've worked with these models before. What would you suggest?" Every eye in the room turned to me. I felt a spike of satisfaction but kept my face neutral. The baseline parameters were set in Q2. "Unless you're changing the fundamental assumptions, we should proceed with the existing framework." Brielle nodded like I'd said something profound. Exactly what I was thinking. After the meeting, she cornered me at my desk. "I need your help redoing the deck for Friday's review, just to make sure it's polished." I spent the next evening rebuilding Brielle's presentation deck, working from the files she'd sent me. As I reviewed the quarterly numbers Alden had approved, something caught my eye. 2 vendor payments didn't match the finance department records I'd saved from earlier in the quarter. One was the Apex Solutions payment I'd already flagged. The other was a $7,000 payment to something called Brightway Consulting Group. I pulled up my own records. Neither vendor appeared in our approved procurement list. Both payments had been processed within 2 weeks of each other. Both had been signed off by Alden personally, bypassing the usual approval chain. I sat back, my pulse racing. Then I noticed something else. The date on one of the finance reconciliation emails, the one that had been mistakenly sent to me, matched exactly with the Apex payment. That wasn't a coincidence. Finance had flagged the discrepancy. They tried to loop in whoever was responsible, and somehow I'd been the one who received it. Over the next week, I became a ghost. I arrived early, stayed late, and quietly collected everything. Screenshots, email chains, timestamps, approval records. I organized it all in a secure folder on my personal laptop, creating a timeline that showed exactly when each suspicious payment had been processed. The pattern was clear. Alden had approved both vendor payments using emergency procurement authority, a power reserved for critical, time-sensitive contracts. But neither Apex Solutions nor Brightway Consulting provided critical services. In fact, when I searched their business registrations, both companies had been created less than 6 months ago. Both listed the same business address, a mailbox rental facility in the suburbs. And both had received payments totaling $19,000 from our department. Then I found the final piece. Alden had approved a financial exception to push through the Brightway payment. Except he didn't have authority to approve exceptions over $5,000. Only the CFO did. I was waiting for the elevator on Thursday afternoon when the doors opened to reveal Catherine Morrison, one of our board members. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed, with gray hair cut in a precise bob. She recognized me immediately. "Tessa Ward," she said, her face lighting up. "I used your forecasting report during our strategic retreat last month. Brilliant work. The board specifically mentioned how valuable your insights were." I felt a flush of validation. "Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful." She pressed the button for the ground floor. "I've been meaning to reach out. We're looking at expanding our analytics capabilities, and I wanted your input on the initiative." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person anymore. The analytics division has new leadership now." Catherine's expression changed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I'm not the director anymore," I said carefully. "Brielle Hastings took over the role 2 weeks ago." Catherine's face went completely still. "Why aren't you leading analytics anymore?" By the following Monday, whispers had started rippling through the office. People were asking questions. Why would they promote Brielle over Tessa? I heard someone say near the break room. "She doesn't even understand the models." "Alden must have his reasons," someone else replied. But the doubt was there now, spreading like cracks in ice. I kept my head down, working quietly. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, someone slipped a folded note onto my desk while I was in the bathroom. When I returned and opened it, my hands started shaking. The note was typed anonymous. Check the procurement logs. Look at who recommended the vendors. I stared at the message, my mind racing.
Someone else knew.
Someone else had noticed the irregularities. I logged into the procurement system using my basic access and navigated to the vendor approval queue. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. There it was. Both Apex Solutions and Brightway Consulting had been recommended for approval by the same person, Brielle Hastings. The procurement logs told a clear story. Brielle had submitted both vendor recommendations through the new supplier portal, claiming they were highly qualified firms she'd worked with at her previous company. Alden had fast-tracked both approvals, bypassing the usual vetting process. The payments had been processed within days. But here's what made my blood run cold. The invoices were inflated. I pulled up industry standard rates for similar consulting services. Apex Solutions had charged 3 times the normal rate. Brightway had charged double. Together, they'd overcharged the company by at least $11,000. And Alden had signed off on everything without questions, without oversight. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was fraud. Or, at the very least, gross negligence. And the board had no idea. They were still operating under the assumption that Alden was running a tight ship, that his department was efficient and well-managed. I closed the browser and leaned back in my chair. My hands were shaking, but my mind was completely clear. Thursday morning, Alden called a department meeting. He strode in with his usual swagger, Brielle trailing behind him like a shadow. I wanted to align everyone on expectations, he began, leaning against the table. We've had some transitions, but we're moving forward with a stronger structure. He talked about efficiency and strategic reorganization. He praised Brielle's fresh perspective and innovative thinking. He didn't mention me once. When someone asked about the upcoming quarterly review, Alden's smile widened. We're ready. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. The board will see exactly what this team is capable of. Brielle nodded eagerly.
But I noticed something.
Her hands were trembling. She kept fidgeting with her notepad, her eyes darting between Alden and the rest of us. She looked nervous. Terrified, even. Alden continued. The quarterly review is mandatory this time. Full board attendance. They want a deep dive into our Q3 performance and Q4 projections. My pulse quickened. The board would be there. All of them, including Catherine Morrison. I spent that night at my dining room table, surrounded by printed documents, highlighters, and tabs. I worked like a prosecutor building a case, organizing every piece of evidence into a clear, undeniable narrative. The vendor payments, the approval irregularities, the inflated invoices, the emergency authority Alden didn't have. My hands trembled as I worked, but my mind was sharp, focused. I created a timeline that showed exactly how everything had unfolded. I flagged every deviation from policy, every suspicious signature, every unexplained decision. Then I found it, the final piece of evidence I needed. Buried in the metadata of Alden's approval form for the Brightway payment was a timestamp that didn't match. He'd claimed he approved it on September 15th at 2 p.m. But the metadata showed the form had been modified on September 17th at 6 p.m., 2 days later. He'd forged the timestamp to make it look like the approval had happened during business hours, within the proper review window. I sat back, staring at the proof. My heart was pounding. This was it. On Friday morning, I heard whispers that the board had requested additional documentation from Brielle directly. She spent most of the day behind closed doors with Alden, her voice rising occasionally in panic. I don't understand what they're asking for, I heard her say through the thin walls. At the end of the day, she appeared at my desk. Her polished exterior had cracked. Her makeup was smudged, her blazer wrinkled. Tessa, I need your help, she said quietly. The board is asking about variance analysis methodologies, and I'm not sure how to explain the framework you built. I looked up at her, keeping my expression neutral. What specifically are they asking? Everything, she said, her voice breaking. They want granular detail on the Q3 discrepancies. They're asking questions I can't answer. Please, I'm in over my head. I held her gaze for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, I know. Her face went pale. What? I know, I repeated. About the vendors. About the payments. About everything. She stared at me, frozen. Then she turned and walked away without another word. Monday morning, Alden stormed into my workspace. His face was flushed, his tie loosened. I know what you're doing, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Undermining leadership. Poisoning the team against us. You're bitter about the demotion, and you're lashing out. I stopped typing and looked up at him calmly. I'm just doing my job. No, you're sabotaging Brielle. Feeding information to the board. Don't think I don't know. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his glare. Is that what you want to tell the board? His face went pale. What? Is that your explanation? That I'm sabotaging you? I kept my voice level, professional. Because if you're planning to make that accusation at the quarterly review, I'd suggest you bring evidence. Alden opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands were shaking. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he finally said. Actually, I replied. I think I do. He stared at me for another moment, then turned and walked away. I watched him go, my heart pounding but my expression unchanged. The quarterly review was held in the main boardroom on the third floor. The space was elegant, dark wood paneling, leather chairs, a massive table that could seat 20 people. 8 board members sat on one side, including Catherine Morrison at the center. Alden sat at the head of the table, Brielle beside him. I was positioned near the back, officially there as supporting staff. Alden started his presentation with practiced confidence. He smiled too much, talked too fast, his hands gesturing broadly as he clicked through slides. Q3 was a strong quarter for analytics, he began. We've implemented new leadership structures and streamlined our processes. He showed charts I'd created, numbers I'd compiled, insights I'd developed. He didn't mention my name once. The board listened politely. Then Catherine raised her hand. Can you explain the $12,000 variance in procurement spending? Alden's smile faltered. That was resolved through normal reconciliation processes. Who approved the payment? She pressed. I did, Alden said. It was within my authority. Catherine glanced at her notes. Actually, the payment required CFO approval. Did you obtain that? Alden's face went red. Sweat beaded on his forehead. There may have been some administrative confusion, but the vendor was properly vetted. By whom? Another board member asked. Alden gestured to Brielle. Brielle conducted the vetting. She has experience with these firms. Brielle looked like she might faint. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Catherine turned to her. Ms. Hastings, can you walk us through your vetting process? Brielle's mouth opened, but no sound came out. We looked at their credentials. What credentials specifically? Catherine asked. I'd need to pull the documentation, Brielle stammered. The board members exchanged glances. Catherine's expression was ice. Then she turned to me. Tessa, you flagged this variance originally, didn't you? Do you have insight into this? The room went silent. Every eye turned to me. I felt my pulse spike but kept my face calm. I stood up, holding the folder I'd prepared. Yes, I said. I have quite a bit of insight. I walked to the front of the room, my footsteps steady. I opened the folder and began walking the board through everything. The timeline, the vendor payments, the inflated invoices, the approval irregularities. I showed them the email that had been sent to me by mistake, the one that had started everything. I showed them the metadata proving Alden had forged the timestamp on his approval form. I explained how Brielle had recommended both vendors, how Alden had bypassed normal vetting procedures, how together they'd cost the company at least $11,000 in fraudulent charges. My voice was calm, steady, professional. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply presenting facts. The board listened in complete silence. I could feel the room shift, the weight of realization settling over everyone. When I finished, I closed the folder and looked at Catherine. I have copies of all documentation if you'd like to review it. Catherine nodded slowly. We would. Thank you, Tessa. I returned to my seat. The silence was deafening. Alden tried to interrupt. These are circumstantial accusations, Mr. Dawson. Catherine cut him off, her voice sharp. Sit down. For the next 30 minutes, the board asked questions. Detailed, pointed questions that Alden couldn't answer. He stumbled through explanations, contradicting himself, his confidence completely shattered. Brielle tried to defend herself. I didn't know the invoices were inflated. Alden told me these were standard rates. But you recommended the vendors, a board member pointed out. Based on what criteria? They seemed reputable. Had you worked with them before, as you claimed in your recommendation? Brielle's face crumbled. Not directly, but... So you lied in your vendor recommendation form? She didn't answer. Finally, Catherine called for a private board session. Mr. Dawson, Ms. Hastings, please wait outside. As they left, Alden shot me a look of pure hatred. Brielle wouldn't meet my eyes. 20 minutes later, we were called back in. Catherine's expression was grave. The board has voted unanimously to remove Alden Dawson as department head, effective immediately. Ms. Hastings, you're being reassigned to a junior analyst role pending further investigation. Catherine turned to me. Tessa, we owe you an apology. It's clear now that your demotion was part of a larger pattern of misconduct.
She paused.
We'd like to ask you to step into the interim department head role while we conduct a full review. I looked at her, letting the moment settle. 3 weeks ago, I'd been humiliated in a conference room, pushed aside for someone unqualified. Now I was being offered back what should have been mine all along. But I didn't gloat. I didn't smile triumphantly. I simply nodded. I accept. As we left the boardroom, I walked past Alden. Security was waiting to escort him out. He wouldn't look at me. Brielle stood against the wall, her face in her hands, crying. I felt no satisfaction in her tears. No joy in Alden's downfall. Just a quiet sense of justice. That afternoon, I received my new security badge, Director of Analytics, just like before. I stood in my office, the one that had been briefly stolen, and looked out at the team. They were already working better, breathing easier. Power isn't loud. It isn't vengeful. Sometimes, power is just being patient enough to let the truth speak for itself.